Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Engineer's Thumb. Chapter 1. It was a dreary evening in late October when the case that would defy all reason was first presented to Sherlock Holmes. I recall the gaslight's feeble glow flickering against the thick London fog as I made my way to Baker Street, my cane tapping steadily against the cobbled pavement. The hour was late, and yet, as I stepped into the familiar warmth of 221B, I found Holmes, as ever, lost in his own contemplations. He was sprawled upon the settee, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded in thought. A single envelope lay upon the table before him, its seal unbroken, as if the very contents within demanded hesitation. "You look troubled, Holmes," I remarked, setting down my hat. "Has some dreadful missive arrived to disturb your peace?" Holmes exhaled a thin wisp of smoke from his pipe before replying, "Troubled? No, Watson. Intrigued. There is a matter before us that does not abide by the laws of conventional reality." Before I could inquire further, the clatter of hurried footsteps upon the staircase announced our visitor. Mrs. Hudson had barely time to usher the man in before he stumbled forward, his face a mask of quiet desperation. He was a man in his early 40s, his clothes modest yet well kept, suggesting an engineer or a clerk of respectable standing. His complexion was pale, his forehead beaded with perspiration, despite the chill. The most striking thing about him, however, was his eyes, wide and haunted, as if he had peered into an abyss and found it staring back. "You must be Mr. Holmes," he gasped, wringing his hat between trembling fingers. "Forgive the hour, but I had nowhere else to turn. They told me you were the only man who might believe me." Holmes sat forward, his gaze sharpening. "And who, pray, are they?" The man opened his mouth to answer, then faltered, his brows knitted together, his lips forming silent syllables. It was as if he were grappling with some unseen force that pulled at the very fabric of his mind. I don't know," he whispered finally. "I don't know my own name." A chill ran through me at those words. Holmes, however, merely gestured to the chair across from him. "Then let us begin with what you do remember." Chapter 2. The man swallowed hard before sinking into the chair, his fingers curling against the armrest as if to anchor himself. "I woke this morning in a room I did not recognize," he began, his voice strained. "It was not my home, nor any place I recall visiting. My clothes were neatly laid out, my boots polished as if prepared by an unseen hand. I searched for anything, a letter, a note, some sign of my name, but there was nothing. No papers, no possessions. Even my pockets were empty. When I looked into the mirror, I did not recognize myself." "Curious," murmured Holmes. "And yet you found your way here." The man nodded. "Because there was one thing. A single piece of paper left on the bedside table. It bore only an address, yours." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "A rather specific instruction for a man without identity," I noted. "Do you recall how you arrived in London?" "That is the most perplexing part, Doctor," he admitted. "I do not recall anything before this morning. No memories of family, no sense of past. And yet my hands," he held them out, trembling. "These hands know work. I can feel it in the calluses, in the muscle memory when I make a fist. I am certain I was an engineer. I just don't know where or for whom." Holmes tapped his fingers against the armrest, his gaze never leaving our visitor. "Tell me, sir, have you attempted to verify your existence? Sought a name in ledgers, spoken to the authorities?" The man's breath hitched. "Yes," he whispered. "I went to the records office first. There was nothing. No birth record, no employment history. The clerk searched every registry he could find. My name, whatever it once was, does not exist." A hush fell over the room, the ticking of the mantel clock unnaturally loud in its stead. Fascinating, Holmes murmured, his lips curling into the ghost of a smile. Watson, what do you make of our guest? I hesitated. A case of amnesia, perhaps. But the missing records, the letter directing him here, it suggests an external hand at play. If this man were truly erased from history, then the question is why, and more importantly, by whom? Holmes nodded approvingly. Quite so, and I suspect we shall have our answer soon enough. Rising from his chair, he retrieved the envelope from the table, the very same I had noticed upon my arrival. Breaking the seal, he withdrew a single sheet of paper. He read it once, then twice. His expression remained unreadable, but when he finally spoke, his voice was curiously flat. It seems, he said, turning the letter toward us, that our mystery has only just begun. I leaned forward to read the page. There were no words, only a single smudged fingerprint pressed against the parchment. A fingerprint, I realized with a shudder, that did not belong to any of us. Chapter 3. Holmes turned the parchment between his fingers, his expression impassive yet intensely focused. The single smudged fingerprint, a ghostly remnant of some unseen force, seemed to hold his attention, as though it were a cipher waiting to be unlocked. Curious, he murmured at last. A message without words, yet one that speaks volumes. I glanced at our nameless visitor. The man sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrests. The discovery of the letter had rattled him, but there was something else, something deeper, a distant horror, as if he had just seen something that should not be. "Does this print mean something to you?" I asked him gently. His lips parted, but no words came forth. He shook his head after a moment, rubbing his temples in frustration. "No, at least, I should know. It feels like I should. But the more I try to recall, the further the thought slips away, like a dream dissolving at dawn." Holmes tapped his fingertips together, his eyes fixed upon the man, as if dissecting his very soul. "Let us establish one thing with certainty," he said at last. "Despite the absence of records, you do exist. You have knowledge of your trade, an instinct for London's streets." The man flinched. Holmes' sharp eyes caught it immediately. "Ah, you do recall London, then?" A flicker of something passed over the man's face. Yes. No, it's strange. I knew how to find my way here, but I don't know how I knew. The names of streets feel familiar, but if I try to think of them, I cannot recall a single one. Selective amnesia is an intriguing affliction, Holmes mused. But yours is not natural. The man's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Holmes flicked his gaze toward me. "Watson, what is the likelihood that an individual could suffer total erasure from official records, yet retain muscle memory, professional instincts, and a fragmentary grasp of location?" I considered for a moment. Memory loss typically follows a pattern, whether due to head trauma, neurological conditions, or extreme psychological distress. But for his very existence to be erased from legal documents, employment ledgers, and government archives, that is not an affliction. That is a design. Holmes smiled thinly. "Precisely." The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Then, I am being erased deliberately." "Not erased," Holmes corrected. "Unmade." The word lingered in the air like a spectre. I shifted uncomfortably. "But surely, Holmes, such a thing is impossible. One cannot simply remove a person from history." Holmes tilted his head. "Then tell me, Watson, what is the name of the Prime Minister?" I opened my mouth at once to answer, then paused. The name, once so familiar, teetered just beyond reach. I furrowed my brow, attempting to summon it forth. It's... A strange sensation crawled up my spine. This is ridiculous. I know his name as well as my own. "Do you?" Holmes asked, watching me closely. My pulse quickened. I turned to our visitor. You said you searched the records office. Was there anything else? Any clue as to why you've been erased? The man nodded slowly. Yes, there was one thing. A name. Holmes' interest sharpened. Hose. The man hesitated, as though the act of speaking it might invoke some unseen force. Finally, he whispered, Henry Acton. The moment the name left his lips, the gaslights flickered. A chill swept through the room. Not the natural draught of an autumn night, but something deeper, something wrong. Holmes sat back, steepling his fingers. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, yet carried a weight that sent a tremor through my chest. Ah, he murmured. Then, my dear fellow, we are in grave danger indeed. Chapter 4. For a long moment, silence hung in the air, heavy as the London fog pressing against the window panes. Henry Acton. The name lingered in my mind like an echo in a vast empty chamber, something I should know yet could not place. Holmes remained perfectly still, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on the man before us. I recognized that look. It was the expression of a mind that had already begun dismantling the puzzle piece by piece. You are certain of this name? Holmes asked at last. His voice, though measured, carried a weight I could not yet understand. The man nodded, his throat working as he swallowed. It was all I found. Scribbled in the margin of a ledger in the records office. The ink was faded, old, I think. But the moment I read it, I felt something. He exhaled shakily. A pull, as if the name was familiar, though I have no memory of it. I turned to Holmes. Henry Acton. Do you know of him? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his index of names and cases, a meticulous collection of notes he had compiled over the years. He flipped through the pages swiftly, pausing only once. Then, with an almost imperceptible frown, he closed the book and set it aside. There is no Henry Acton, he said. The nameless man's fingers clenched. But I saw it written. Holmes inclined his head. That I do not doubt. However, the absence of a name in my records is not the concern. The concern is that, by all conventional measures, Henry Acton does not exist. A prickling unease ran down my spine. You mean to say he never existed? Holmes' expression remained unreadable. Or that he existed once, but was removed so thoroughly that even my own records do not account for him. I glanced at the stranger. His face had paled considerably, as though he were now realizing the depth of the abyss into which he had stumbled. You found this name in a ledger, Holmes continued. Tell me, did you notice anything peculiar about the book itself? The man hesitated. It was old. The pages had yellowed, but it was well kept, too well kept, as if it had been stored away deliberately. The ink had faded in places, yet the name was still there, as though it refused to be forgotten. Holmes exhaled softly, a breath that might have passed for amusement in another context. A name unwilling to be erased. How very inconvenient for those who would see it gone. I shifted uneasily. Holmes, you were speaking as if something is altering reality itself. Not altering, Watson. Curating. A cold hush fell over the room. Holmes stood abruptly and reached for his coat. Come, Watson, we must see this ledger for ourselves before it vanishes like our friend here. The man stiffened. Vanishes. Holmes cast him a sharp glance. You are still here for now. But if someone has gone to such extraordinary lengths to erase Henry Acton from history, I must assume they will not take kindly to your interference. The man's lips parted, but no words came. I rose as well, hastily grabbing my medical bag. And what if we are already too late? Holmes gave a thin smile. Then, my dear Watson, we shall simply have to remember what was never meant to be known. And with that, we stepped out into the fog-shrouded streets of London, chasing the ghost of a name that should not exist. Chapter 5. London at night is a city of whispers and shadows. The gas lamps flickered feebly in the damp air, their glow swallowed by the fog that curled through the streets. The distant clip of hooves and the occasional shout of a cabman, lost in the mist, were the only sounds accompanying us as we made our way toward the records office. Our nameless companion walked between Holmes and me, his posture tense, his head turning sharply at every passing figure. It was the look of a man who expected to be snatched away at any moment. Holmes, however, strode with purpose, his hands tucked into his coat, his sharp eyes scanning the streets with that peculiar keenness that suggested he was absorbing more than he let on. "You have not asked the obvious question, Watson," he murmured as we neared our destination. I exhaled, my breath curling in the cold. "Which is? Why, if someone has gone to such lengths to erase Henry Acton, would they leave his name scrawled in a public record?" I frowned. Perhaps they overlooked it. Holmes gave me a sidelong glance, one of faint amusement. "Watson, you insult our opponents. If they have the power to erase a man so thoroughly that not even my files contain a mention of him, then they would not be so careless as to leave a name lingering in a ledger. Then why is it there?" Holmes' smile did not reach his eyes. "That, my dear fellow, is what we are about to find out." We reached the records office, an unassuming stone building tucked between a butcher's shop and a clockmaker's. At this hour it was closed to the public, but Holmes had long since learned that doors were mere inconveniences rather than obstacles. Producing a slender length of wire, he set to work on the lock, his movements quick and precise. A soft click, and the door creaked open. "After you, gentlemen," Holmes whispered. The air inside was thick with the scent of old parchment and ink. We moved through the rows of towering shelves, the only sound our careful footsteps against the wooden floor. Holmes produced a match, striking it against the wall to light a lantern. "Where did you find the name?" he asked our companion. The man hesitated, then led us through the aisles, his breathing shallow. He paused before a heavy wooden desk where a stack of bound ledgers rested. "It was here," he murmured, reaching for the book. His fingers met empty space. The ledger was gone. A cold dread settled over me. I turned to Holmes, expecting some exclamation, some flash of irritation. Instead, he merely observed the empty space where the book had been, his expression unreadable. "So," he said at last, "we are not alone in our interest after all." The nameless man's breathing grew erratic. "It was here. I swear it. Just this morning." "Yes," Holmes agreed. "And now it is not." I swallowed. Who would have taken it? "Someone who does not wish us to read it," Holmes replied simply. My grip tightened around my medical bag. "Holmes, what if this isn't just a matter of theft? What if the book never existed at all?" Our companion let out a strangled sound. "No, I saw it. I touched it. It was real." Holmes regarded him coolly. "As were you once." A chill ran down my spine at his words. Holmes turned away from the empty desk, his sharp gaze sweeping the shelves, searching. "We are missing something," he murmured. "If they have removed the record, there must be a trace, a fingerprint, an indentation, some sign that it was here." He crouched, running his fingers lightly over the wood. Then he exhaled softly. "Watson," he murmured, "bring the lantern closer." I stepped forward, the warm glow spilling over the desk. There, etched into the wood, as though burned into the very grain, was a name: Henry Acton. The lettering was crude, as if scratched by a desperate hand. The nameless man recoiled, his face ashen. "I did not do that," he whispered. Holmes straightened. "No, I believe you did not." A slow, dreadful realization unfurled in my mind. Then who did? Holmes dusted his hands off and turned toward the door. "Come, Watson. Our search is not yet over. I glanced at the name once more before following him. The letters seemed to shimmer in the lantern light as though they did not wish to be forgotten. Chapter 6. Holmes did not speak as we stepped out of the records office and into the cold embrace of the London night. The fog had thickened, clinging to the gaslit streets like a living thing swallowing the city whole. The name, Henry Acton, burned in my mind, an enigma that refused to be silenced. Beside me, our nameless companion was pale, his breath unsteady. The realization that the ledger had vanished, that his only proof had been taken, seemed to unmoor him further. "It was there," he muttered. "It was there, and now it's not." "Yes," Holmes murmured. "Which means someone is watching our progress closely." I pulled my coat tighter around me. "Holmes, what do we do now?" Holmes tapped his fingers against his coat pocket. "There is still one avenue left to us." He turned to the man. "Tell me, before you came to the records office, where did you wake?" The man hesitated. "A house. A townhouse, I think. In Westminster. I remember dark wood, old curtains, the smell of ink and dust. But his brow furrowed. "I don't know how I got there." "An address?" "No. I looked, but there were no street signs, no house number. It felt hidden." Holmes' eyes glinted. "Then let us find the house that does not exist." We took a cab to Westminster, though our passenger was of little use in guiding us. He clutched his coat, his gaze darting from street to street, his confusion deepening as we wove through the mist-laden avenues. "It should be here," he murmured, his voice strained. "I should recognize something." Holmes, ever patient, simply observed. "You are experiencing an unnatural displacement, memories altered, perceptions muddled. But the mind is resilient. Let us try a different approach." He gestured toward the street. "Walk as you did before. Do not think. Only move." The man swallowed, nodded, then stepped forward, his pace hesitant at first, then more certain, as if something deep within him remembered the path his conscious mind could not. We followed in silence, the gaslights flickering overhead. Then suddenly he stopped. He turned, staring at the space before him. Holmes and I followed his gaze, and found ourselves looking at a narrow alleyway between two buildings, dark and empty, leading to nothing. The man's breath hitched. No, this is wrong." Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze scanning the alley. "What do you see?" The man ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. "It was here. The house was here." I frowned. "Holmes, there is nothing here, just an alley." Holmes tilted his head. "Precisely." He moved forward, brushing his fingertips along the bricks of the adjacent buildings, his movements meticulous. Then he crouched, pressing his palm against the cold stone. "There are gaps," he murmured. "Gaps?" I stepped closer. Holmes gestured toward the wall. "This alley is too narrow. The buildings on either side do not align with the layout of the street. There was something here, and now there is not." My pulse quickened. "You mean the house was removed?" Holmes exhaled, standing. "Not removed, erased." The nameless man let out a strangled breath. Then where was I? If I woke in that house this morning, and now it's gone. Holmes turned to him, his gaze unyielding. "Then someone allowed you to leave. The question is why?" The man pressed his hands to his temples, his distress mounting. "Holmes, what if I was never supposed to exist at all?" The words sent a chill through me. I turned to Holmes, searching his face for reassurance, for some rational dismissal of such an idea. But Holmes only stared at the empty alleyway, his fingers tightening into a fist. "Then, Watson," he murmured, "we are chasing a ghost through a city that does not know it has lost him." Chapter 7. The three of us stood before the empty alleyway, the chill of the London night sinking into our bones. The air felt heavier than before, as though something unseen pressed against us, watching. Holmes' face remained impassive, but I saw the minute shifts in his posture, the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the way his fingers curled at his sides. Something was wrong. "I do not believe we are alone," he murmured. I turned sharply, scanning the fog-laden street. It was empty, eerily so. Not a single cab rolled past. No late-night revellers stumbled home from the taverns. Westminster should not have been so silent. And yet the quiet was suffocating. Our nameless companion shifted uneasily, his gaze darting around the mist. "Holmes, I feel as though we are being watched." "You are," Holmes replied calmly. I followed his gaze. At first I saw nothing. Then a shape, just at the edge of the fog. A figure stood across the street, motionless. No details, only the silhouette of a man half obscured by the mist. Watching. I tensed. "Holmes." "Yes, Watson. I see him." The figure did not move. For several long moments none of us spoke. Then Holmes took a single step forward. The figure vanished. Not into the fog, not into a side street, just gone. The breath left my lungs in a sharp exhale. "Did you?" "Yes." Holmes' voice was clipped. He turned swiftly to our companion. "We must leave. Now." The man hesitated. "But the house?" "There is no house," Holmes said firmly. "And if we linger, there may soon be no us." I had seen Holmes in many moves, calm, detached, even frustrated on occasion. But I had never seen him like this. There was no excitement in his eyes, no trace of the thrill he usually found in a puzzle. This was not curiosity. This was calculated urgency. That alone was enough to set me moving. We hailed a cab on the next street, Holmes giving the driver an address in a low voice. I climbed in after him, the nameless man pressing himself into the seat beside me as if to make himself small. Only once the cab began rolling did I find my voice. "Holmes," I said, keeping my tone level, "explain." "Now." Holmes leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together. "Someone, or something, has been watching us from the moment we set foot in Westminster." "You mean the man in the fog?" "Not just him. We have been followed since we left Baker Street. Small details, shadows that do not belong, the unnatural silence of the streets, the absence of any witnesses to our search. This was a controlled space, Watson." The thought chilled me. Controlled by whom? Holmes exhaled through his nose. "That is what we must determine." The nameless man shifted beside me. "Holmes, I do not understand. If this is true, if someone is orchestrating all of this, then why was I allowed to leave the house?" Holmes' eyes met his, sharp and calculating. "That is the question, isn't it?" The man swallowed. "What if they wanted me to come to you?" Holmes leaned back slightly, tapping his fingers against the seat. "Then we must consider what we are meant to see, and more importantly, what we are meant to forget." The word "forget" landed heavily in the cab, stirring an unspoken fear that neither I nor our companion dared voice. Holmes' gaze darkened. "This is no ordinary conspiracy, Watson. We are dealing with those who do not simply kill. They erase." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Holmes turned sharply, pulling the curtain back from the cab window. For the briefest moment, I caught a glimpse of the street outside. The lamps flickered as the cab rattled over the cobbles. The fog swirled. And then I saw it. A man. Not one of the usual passers-by. Not a policeman. Not a stranger waiting for a cab. A man standing perfectly still at the side of the road, his head tilted slightly, watching. Holmes released the curtain and let it fall back into place. "They are still following," he said quietly. The words sent a cold shiver through me. The cab did not stop until we reached Baker Street. Chapter 8. Baker Street had never felt so unwelcoming. The moment we stepped from the cab, Holmes scanned the surrounding buildings, his gaze flicking to every shadow, every silhouette lingering under the gaslights. He said nothing, but I could tell he was gauging whether we had truly left our watchers behind or merely led them home. Mrs. Hudson greeted us at the door, but Holmes brushed past her inquiries, his long strides carrying him up the stairs to our sitting room. The moment the door shut behind us, he turned to our nameless companion. "You will stay inside. Do not stand near the windows. Do not open the door for anyone." The man, pale and visibly shaken, nodded. "But Holmes, what is this? Who is after me?" Holmes ignored the question, already pulling his files from the bookshelf, flipping through documents with practiced efficiency. "Watson, pour him a drink, something to steady his nerves." I moved to the cabinet, though my own hands were none too steady as I poured a measure of brandy. Holmes was rattled. I had seen him in tense situations before, but never like this. "Holmes," I said, setting the glass down, "we need answers." Holmes did not pause in his work. "Watson, you saw what I saw tonight. A man who was there, until he wasn't. A house that existed, until it didn't. A name burned into wood, as if it refused to be forgotten." He pulled a file from the shelf, flipping it open. "Whoever or whatever is behind this, they are not merely erasing records. They are erasing perception itself." The man clutched the drink with trembling fingers. "But why me?" Holmes turned to him, studying him in that piercing way of his, as though he could strip away flesh and bone to see the truth beneath. "That," he said, "is what we must determine before they succeed in making you disappear entirely." I sat forward. "You have a theory, Holmes." "A working hypothesis," he corrected. He retrieved the smudged letter from the table, the one bearing the single fingerprint. "This," he murmured, holding it up, "is our only tangible evidence that something real has occurred. But if I am correct, we are looking for something more than a mere secret society covering its tracks. We are dealing with a force that manipulates reality itself." The words made my blood run cold. "You cannot mean that literally." "Can I not?" Holmes' lips curled slightly. "Tell me, Watson, have you ever considered what it would mean if history were curated?" The concept made my head ache. "History is recorded, Holmes. It is not something that changes." Holmes smiled thinly. "Is it?" He turned to our guest. "Tell me, if I were to ask you the name of the current Prime Minister, could you answer?" The man blinked. His lips parted. Then nothing. His expression crumpled in horror. I should know," he whispered. "I do know. But I cannot say it. I felt the breath leave my lungs." "Holmes." "Precisely, Watson," Holmes murmured. "We are dealing with an intelligence that does not merely remove information, it obscures the very memory of it." The nameless man pressed a hand to his head. "Then I was meant to be forgotten." Holmes' gaze was unreadable. "Not merely forgotten, erased, but something went wrong. You should not exist, and yet here you are." The man swallowed, his knuckles white against the glass. "Then what do we do?" Holmes turned back to his files, selecting one in particular. "We begin at the only logical place," he said. I leaned forward, reading the title on the page. Henry Acton. The name we were never meant to remember. Holmes exhaled softly. "We must find the man who no longer exists, and in doing so, we will uncover the truth they do not wish us to see." I glanced at the window, half expecting to see another shadow lurking beyond the glass. Somehow, I knew our watchers had not gone far. Chapter 9. Holmes sat before the fire, his fingers tapping in rhythmic succession against the armrest of his chair. The name Henry Acton lay between us, scribbled across the open file in his neat, precise hand. It was the only true lead we had, And yet, even as we studied it, a silent force pressed upon the room, as though the very walls wished to swallow it whole. I had felt fear before, in war, on the streets of London, but this was something else. This was the fear of forgetting. Our nameless guest sat hunched on the edge of his chair, his drink untouched, his fingers twitching as though grasping for something unseen. "Holmes," he murmured, "if they can erase a man from history, what hope do we have of finding him?" Holmes exhaled, then flipped open the file. "The erasure is not perfect," he said. "There are cracks in the illusion. The name remained in the ledger long after it should have been gone. Your presence here, against all odds, is proof that they failed in their attempt to erase you completely. And now," he tapped a finger against the paper, "we have a lead." I frowned. But what lead, Holmes? A name is not enough. Holmes' gaze lifted, sharp and knowing. "Is it not? Consider, Watson, if Henry Acton no longer exists, then the mere act of speaking his name should be impossible. And yet here it is. This suggests two possibilities." He held up a single finger. "One, Henry Acton is still alive, but hidden from us. Then a second. Or two, he is dead, but not forgotten." A heavy silence followed. Our guest shifted. "If he's dead, then who remembers him?" Holmes' lips curled into a faint, mirthless smile. "That, my dear fellow, is what we must uncover. The search for Henry Acton began with the simplest of inquiries. Holmes sent out a series of telegrams, one to a trusted informant at Scotland Yard, another to a clerk at the London Archives, and a third cryptic message to a contact he refused to name. Hours passed. The night deepened. By the time the first reply arrived, dawn was pressing faint gold against the fog. Holmes took the telegram from Mrs. Hudson without a word, unfolded it, and read it with a flicker of interest before handing it to me. No record of A.C. Toulon. No birth, death, or residence found. Name Dewey's enote exist. I exhaled sharply. "So he has been erased entirely?" "Not quite," Holmes murmured. "Note what is missing, Watson." I reread the message. There is no record of birth, death, or residency, but nothing about work. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely. They erased his existence, but not his occupation." The realization struck me cold. "You mean to say he was someone, but they did not erase what he was?" Holmes turned to our guest. "You are an engineer, yes?" The man hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I think so." Holmes' smile did not reach his eyes. "Then I suggest we search not for who Henry Acton was, but for what he did." The British Engineering Society was a tightly guarded institution, but Holmes had long since mastered the art of bypassing bureaucratic barriers. Within hours he had secured an appointment under the pretense of researching industrial advancements. We arrived at the grand stone building near the Thames, its interior lined with shelves of records, years of innovation catalogued in careful, precise handwriting. Holmes spoke with the archivist, a bespectacled man with ink-stained fingers, while I and our nameless companion observed from a distance. "We are looking for records concerning a man named Henry Acton," Holmes said. The archivist frowned. "Acton, that name is unfamiliar to me. Nonetheless, I would appreciate a search through your archives." The man hesitated, then nodded, disappearing into the back room. We waited in tense silence. Minutes passed, then too long. Holmes exhaled sharply. Something is wrong. He moved swiftly, slipping past the counter and through the half-open door. I followed, pulse quickening. Inside, the archivist stood frozen before an open drawer, his expression one of deep confusion. Holmes approached. "Have you found something?" The man turned slowly. His fingers trembled. I don't understand. I knew this name. I remember seeing it in the records before, but now—" He gestured helplessly at the empty space where a folder should have been. "It's gone," he whispered. Holmes' expression did not change. "The files have been removed." The archivist swallowed. "Not removed. Erased. The ink, the pages. There's nothing." He turned to us, panic creeping into his voice. "What name did you say again?" Holmes regarded him for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Henry Acton." The archivist's eyes widened. Then, to my horror, something shifted behind them. His breath hitched. His fingers twitched. Then, nothing. His face smoothed over, his expression turning blank. He blinked at us, the panic draining from his gaze as if it had never been there. I'm sorry, gentlemen. Who is it you were asking for?" A cold hand clenched around my spine. Holmes did not hesitate. He took my arm, his grip firm. "We are finished here, Watson." We turned swiftly, our nameless companion stumbling to follow as we left the archives behind. The moment we stepped into the street, I turned to Holmes. He forgot. Holmes' jaw was set, his eyes colder than I had ever seen them. "No," he murmured. "He was made to forget." Our nameless companion let out a shaky breath. "Then what happens to us now?" Holmes gazed into the distance, his hands tightening into fists. "We remember, Watson," he said quietly, "for as long as we can." Chapter 10. We left the British Engineering Society in tense silence, the weight of what we had just witnessed pressing upon us like an invisible force. The archivist had remembered Henry Acton, until he didn't. His memory had been stripped away, not gradually, but in an instant, as though something had reached into his mind and removed the very notion of the man's existence. Holmes' pace was brisk as we moved through the streets of London, his usual air of calculated detachment now undercut by something far graver. He did not speak. He did not slow. His eyes, sharp and searching, flickered to every shadow, as though expecting them to move. At last I could stand the silence no longer. "Holmes," I said, quickening my stride to match his, "you must tell me what you are thinking." He did not stop, but his voice, when he spoke, was measured and deliberate. "I am thinking, Watson, that we are now balancing on the edge of something I do not yet understand. That there is an intelligence at work in this city with the power to manipulate reality, not through violence nor intimidation, but through something far worse." "Erasure," I murmured. "Yes." His lips pressed into a thin line. "They do not merely remove names from ledgers, they remove memory itself." Our nameless companion lagged behind us, his breathing heavy. "Then tell me," he said hoarsely, "why haven't they erased me?" Holmes stopped abruptly. He turned to face the man, his expression unreadable. "Because you are an anomaly. They erased you from records. They erased you from the minds of those who once knew you. But you remain." The man swallowed hard. "So I slipped through the cracks." Holmes' gaze darkened. "No, someone left you outside the cracks." By the time we returned to Baker Street, night had fallen once more, and the city had settled into an unnatural quiet. The gas lamps flickered in the mist, their light swallowed by the thickening fog. Inside, Holmes wasted no time. He moved through the sitting room with purpose, lighting the lamp on his desk and pulling forth a fresh sheet of paper. "We must assume Henry Acton was more than just an engineer," he said, dipping his pen into ink. "If his name has been so thoroughly erased, then his work, whatever it was, must have been of importance. And if the British Engineering Society no longer remembers him, then we must look elsewhere." I lowered myself into my chair, exhaling. "And where do you suggest we begin?" Holmes lifted his gaze. "With the one place that records all things, Watson." "The government." Holmes smiled thinly. "The underground." I stiffened. "Surely you don't mean—" Crime leaves traces where bureaucracy does not, Holmes interjected. And if Acton's name is no longer written in the ledgers of respectable men, we must seek it in the darker corners of London. Those who operate outside the law have their own records, their own memories, and they are far less likely to be rewritten. A knock at the door interrupted him. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed. "Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes rose and accepted the envelope, tearing it open with a swift motion. His eyes scanned the message. Then, for the briefest instant, his expression changed. It was not alarm, not surprise, but something else. He handed me the telegram. "Found him. Dockside. But you must hurry. Things are already fading. No name. No sender. Just a location and a warning." Holmes did not hesitate. Within minutes, we were in another cab, rattling through the city streets toward the docks. The air grew thick with the scent of salt and smoke as we neared the waterfront. The docks were a place of constant movement, sailors, dockworkers, merchants unloading cargo. But as we stepped onto the wooden planks, a strange stillness pressed down upon us. Holmes led the way, weaving between stacks of crates and abandoned barrels. Our nameless companion trailed close behind, his breath uneven. Then Holmes stopped. I followed his gaze. At the far end of the dock, leaning against the railing, stood a man. A thin figure, clad in a dark coat. He was facing away from us, staring out toward the black water. Holmes did not move. Neither did the man. The shiver crawled down my spine. "Holmes." "Wait." We waited. Then slowly the man turned. I gasped. I did not recognize him. I did not know him. And yet, my mind screamed that I should. There was something wrong with his face, not in its features, those were ordinary, forgettable, but in the way it felt in my mind, like an unfinished painting, like a word on the tip of my tongue that I could never quite grasp. Holmes exhaled softly. "Henry Acton," he murmured. The man, Acton, watched us with tired eyes. "You shouldn't have come." Holmes took a slow step forward. "And yet here we are." Acton shook his head. "It won't matter. It never does." "Tell me," Holmes said quietly, "who are they?" Acton blinked. And for the first time I saw fear. "Not who," he whispered. "What?" A gust of wind blew in from the Thames, rattling the docks, kicking up mist from the water. For a single moment the gaslight flickered, and when it steadied, Henry Acton was gone. I turned sharply, my breath catching. Holmes. Holmes' jaw was tight, his fingers curled into fists. I stepped forward, reaching for the spot where Acton had stood, but there was nothing. No footprints on the damp wood. No sign he had ever been there at all. Except a single crumpled scrap of paper fluttered at my feet. I bent, picked it up. A name was scrawled across it in frantic, uneven ink. It was not Henry Acton's name. It was our nameless companion's. I turned. He was staring at the paper, his face ashen, his lips moving soundlessly. Then, a sharp, strangled breath. His eyes widened, and in that moment I knew. He remembered everything. Chapter 11. The wind howled against the docks, whipping through the mist and rattling the rigging of distant ships. But I heard nothing, only the sound of our nameless companion's shallow, unsteady breathing. He clutched the crumpled scrap of paper in his trembling hands, his fingers white against the ink-stained parchment. Holmes did not move. His gaze was fixed on the man before us, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, our companion spoke. "I remember." The words sent a shudder through me. I took a step closer. "What do you remember?" His eyes darted between us, unfocused, frantic. I wasn't supposed to. It was taken from me. Erased. But this name, my name, It brought everything back. Holmes inclined his head slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Then tell us." Our companion swallowed hard. "My name is—" He faltered. His breath hitched. His lips moved, but no sound came forth. I felt my heart tighten in my chest. Holmes' gaze sharpened. "You know it, but you cannot say it." The man's throat worked. His fingers clenched around the paper, as if trying to anchor himself to reality. "They won't let me," he rasped. "Then think, man." I pressed. "What else do you remember?" His eyes fluttered shut. "Henry Acton was real," he whispered. "He wasn't just an engineer. He was one of us." Holmes leaned forward. "Us." The man's breath was uneven. "I was an engineer, yes, but not for the society. My work was secret. It was important." He exhaled sharply. I was part of something larger, something hidden beneath the city." A silence stretched between us. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. A secret project. The man's fingers dug into his scalp. "Not a project," he whispered. "A correction." My blood ran cold. "Correction?" His breath quickened. "They don't just erase people, Doctor. They erase mistakes." Holmes' expression remained impassive, but I saw the flicker of understanding behind his sharp gaze. What was Henry Acton's mistake? The man's lips parted. He saw too much. He questioned what should not be questioned. And his voice cracked. I helped him. I helped him uncover the truth. That's why they took him. That's why they took me. I could barely breathe. "Who took you?" His head snapped up. And for the first time, I saw something new in his expression. Terror. Holmes exhaled slowly. "You remember, don't you?" The man gave a single shuddering nod. Holmes' voice was quiet. "Then tell us before they come to take you again." The man pressed his hands against his temples. "We weren't meant to see it," he whispered. "We weren't meant to know it existed. The city, London itself, it isn't just built on history. It's rewritten. The streets, the names, the people, they change. Some things are added, others disappear." A deep, heavy silence followed his words. Holmes did not blink. "You are telling me, sir, that the very fabric of London is being altered?" The man nodded weakly. "Not just London," he rasped. "The world." I took a slow step back, my mind reeling. That's impossible." Holmes remained still. "And yet, Watson, it is the only explanation that fits." I turned to him, grasping for some shred of logic. "Holmes, do you hear what he is saying?" "Yes," Holmes murmured. "And more importantly, I believe him." The man's breath came fast and more ragged. "Henry Acton found proof. He found the fracture, the place where the world bends. And I helped him map it." "Where?" Holmes asked. The man opened his mouth. And then, suddenly, his body lurched. His eyes widened. And he gasped, a sharp, desperate sound, like a drowning man breaking the surface for air. His hands clawed at his throat. Holmes shot forward, gripping his shoulders. "What is it? Speak, man." The man's gaze snapped to Holmes, pleading, wild, then to me. "Doctor," he choked. I moved to him at once, my hands gripping his arm. "What is happening? Tell me." But already his body was changing. His skin flickered, like candlelight guttering in a draught. His form blurred, the very shape of him shifting at the edges, as though something unseen was pulling at the seams of his existence. He was disappearing. Holmes' grip tightened. "Fight it." But the man's eyes were already dulling. His voice was slipping, his very self unraveling. With his last desperate breath, he managed 2 final words. "Below London." And then he was gone. Not dead, not collapsed, just gone. as though he had never existed at all. The empty space where he had stood sent an unnatural chill crawling up my spine. For a long moment, neither Holmes nor I spoke. Then Holmes exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "We must go beneath the city, Watson." Chapter 12. The room was silent. Where a man had sat only moments before, there was now nothing. No trace of his existence, no lingering warmth in the chair, no indentation upon the rug where his feet had rested. It was as though he had never been. I swallowed hard, forcing my mind to accept what my senses rejected. "Holmes, this is beyond science, beyond reason." Holmes did not reply. He remained motionless, staring at the empty space, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Then, in a voice quiet and controlled, he said, "We must move quickly, Watson." I turned to him, expecting confusion or, even for Holmes, some measure of shock. But his face remained impassive, analytical. "Quickly," I repeated, my pulse still racing. "Holmes, do you not grasp what has just occurred? He vanished. He was sitting here, speaking to us, and then he was gone." Holmes met my gaze, his own sharp and unyielding. "Yes, Watson. And what do we know of men who vanish?" I forced myself to think. "That they are taken." Holmes nodded. "And if they are taken, then there must be somewhere they are taken to." His gaze dropped to the floor, and he told us exactly where. "Below London." A shiver ran down my spine. "You think he was telling the truth?" I asked. Holmes' lips pressed into a thin line. "Watson, consider all that we have seen. The missing records, the erased memories, the distortions in time and place. If there exists a force capable of altering the very fabric of reality, then it stands to reason they must operate from somewhere. And you believe that place lies beneath London." Holmes exhaled softly. "We're better to hide something that must never be found." We left Baker Street within the hour, armed with little more than lanterns, a revolver, and Holmes' unwavering certainty. Our destination was not one of the well-travelled tunnels beneath the city, nor even the hidden smugglers' routes known to certain criminal elements. No, Holmes' investigations had led us somewhere far older. The forgotten tunnels. The passages buried beneath the very foundation of London, lost to time, to progress, to deliberate erasure. We arrived in an abandoned workhouse on the edge of the Thames, its crumbling walls and rotting timbers giving the impression that it had long since been abandoned. And yet, when Holmes pried open the rusted grate in the floor, there was no mistaking the iron rungs of a ladder leading downward. Holmes lit a lantern and handed it to me. "Stay close, Watson." I hesitated at the threshold. The air that drifted up from below was wrong. It smelled not just of damp stone and decay, but of something else, something unsettling. Like old paper, like dust stirred from a book that should never have been opened. And beneath it all, an even fainter scent, something metallic, sharp, and familiar. Blood. I drew my revolver. "After you, Holmes." He smiled faintly and descended. I followed. The tunnel walls were ancient. Unlike the stone and brickwork of London's sewers and underground railways, this place had been carved long before. The air was thick, oppressive, the very walls pressing down as if resentful of our intrusion. We walked in silence, the glow of our lantern casting shifting shadows upon the damp passage. Then Holmes halted abruptly. I nearly walked into him. "What is it?" He raised the lantern. "Do you see, Watson?" I followed his gaze. The walls had changed. Gone were the rough-hewn stone and the water-streaked bricks. In their place, the tunnel had been reinforced, thick iron plates bolted together, stretching into the darkness. And carved upon them, etched deep into the metal, was a single phrase. A name, Henry Acton. My breath caught. Holmes pressed his fingers against the engraving. His expression darkened. "This is a grave," he murmured. I shuddered. What kind of grave is sealed in iron? Holmes said nothing. Then, tap, tap, a sound, faint, hollow, from the other side of the metal. I stiffened, my grip tightening on the revolver. Holmes! He raised a hand for silence. We stood motionless. The tunnel was silent once more. Then, a whisper, so quiet I almost believed I had imagined it. "Help me." A cold dread crawled through me. "Holmes," I breathed, "someone is inside." Holmes exhaled slowly. His fingers traced the bolts sealing the iron plates. Then, with an unreadable expression, he turned to me. "Watson," he said, "this door was not meant to be opened." I swallowed hard. And yet, Holmes murmured, "We must open it." Chapter 13. Holmes stood before the iron door, fingers tracing the deep etchings of Henry Acton's name. The cold metal seemed to swallow the light of our lanterns, as though it did not wish to be seen. And from the other side, the whisper still echoed in my mind. "Help me." I swallowed hard, gripping my revolver. "Holmes, if this is a grave, what are we about to disturb?" Holmes exhaled, his fingers pressing lightly against the rusted bolts sealing the iron plates. "Watson, a grave is merely a marker of what was. But if the occupant is still speaking," he turned to me, eyes gleaming in the lantern glow, "then it is no longer a grave at all." A cold shudder ran through me. "Step back," Holmes murmured. I obeyed as he retrieved a small set of tools from his coat. With precise, deliberate movements, he began working at the corroded bolts. The metal shrieked, a sound unnatural in the heavy silence of the underground, a sound that did not belong. I flinched. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Holmes, perhaps we should." Clank. The first bolt gave way. A deep breath from Holmes, a glance at me, calculating, certain. Then he moved to the next. Clank. The sound echoed far too loud. Holmes hesitated, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening for something beyond our hearing. Then, tap, tap. We both froze. The sound had come from inside. A slow, rhythmic tap against the iron, as if something, or someone, was knocking back. I took an involuntary step away. Holmes. He did not acknowledge me. He only continued faster now. The final bolt, the last barrier between us and whatever lay within, was rusted, warped from age. Holmes set his jaw and drove his pick into it with force. Clank. The bolt gave way. A heavy silence followed. Holmes reached for the iron panel, fingers curling around the edge. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled. The door screamed. Metal grinding against metal. Decades, perhaps centuries, of stillness breaking in an agonizing wail. The stench hit us first. Thick, stagnant. A scent beyond death, beyond decay, something old. Something that should not have been awakened. I gagged, pulling my handkerchief to my nose. God in heaven. Holmes merely lifted the lantern, its flickering glow illuminating the space beyond the door. It was not a grave. It was a room. A chamber, vast and circular, its walls lined with shelves of ancient, dust-coated books. The air was heavy with the weight of forgotten things. And at the center, the chair. A man, seated, motionless, his head bowed, as though in prayer or defeat. My breath caught. Holmes. Holmes stepped forward, ever fearless. His lantern light fell across the figure. And the man moved. A shuddering inhale, ragged, desperate, as though his lungs had not known air in years. Slowly, so slowly, his head lifted, and I saw his face, Henry Acton. Pale, gaunt, eyes sunken, but aware. He looked at us, through us, his lips trembling. Then, in a voice so hoarse it was barely more than breath, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Chapter 14. For a moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the faint hiss of the lantern's flame, its light casting flickering shadows against the iron-walled chamber. Henry Acton sat before us, a living contradiction. His skin was waxen, his form gaunt, yet his eyes burned with the unmistakable spark of consciousness. A man long forgotten, long erased, and yet here he was, breathing, speaking. "You shouldn't have come." Holmes, ever unshaken, took a slow step forward. "And yet, Mr. Acton, here we are." Acton's lips parted, as if to respond, but the words failed him. His gaze flickered between us, and something like recognition passed over his face. Then, a wince, a shuddering inhale. He pressed a trembling hand to his temple, his breath ragged. "It's fading again," he rasped. "I can feel it." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "You mean your memory?" Acton nodded weakly. "Not just mine," he whispered. "Yours, theirs, everything I knew, everything I uncovered." His breath hitched, panic flashing in his gaze. "It's disappearing." My grip on my revolver tightened. "Then tell us now, before it's lost." Acton exhaled sharply, as though forcing himself to hold on to whatever knowledge still remained. He lifted his eyes to Holmes. "I was an engineer," he whispered, "but that was never what mattered. My true work began beneath the city, beneath London." His fingers twitched against the armrest of his chair. "They hired me for something impossible. They told me I was designing structural reinforcements, but it was a lie. I wasn't building anything. I was mapping something that was already there." Holmes leaned in slightly. "What did you find?" Acton's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "A fracture." The chill crawled up my spine. "A fracture in what exactly?" Acton's fingers dug into the armrest. "In history." The words sent a heavy silence through the room. I glanced at Holmes, expecting some measure of skepticism, but his expression remained unreadable. Acton went on, his voice strained. "London is old, older than its maps, older than its records. But there are pieces of it that do not belong. Places that exist in one moment, then vanish the next. People who walk these streets but were never born. I started seeing patterns. A structure hidden beneath the streets, beneath reality itself." He sucked in a sharp breath. "They saw what I was doing." His hands clenched. "And then they erased me." Holmes studied him carefully. "Yet you are still here." A shudder ran through Acton. "Only because I hid myself where they could not reach me. I locked myself away before they could finish the job." Holmes' voice was quiet. "And now they know you are awake." Acton's entire body went rigid. His pupils dilated. He turned sharply, his gaze no longer on us, but past us, into the darkness of the tunnel beyond the iron door. Holmes followed his gaze. So did I. And then I heard it. Tap, tap. My blood turned to ice. Acton's breath came in rapid gasps. "It's too late." The tapping grew louder. Holmes seized Acton's wrist. "What are they, Acton?" Acton's lips parted, but no sound came. His body shuddered violently. He grasped Holmes' forearm with a strength I would not have believed him capable of. And then the iron door slammed shut. The force of it sent a gust of air rushing through the chamber, snuffing out our lantern in an instant. Darkness swallowed us whole, and in that darkness I heard the whisper, not from Acton, not from Holmes, from something else. "You were never here." Chapter 15. Total darkness. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no motion, nothing but the oppressive blackness pressing in from all sides. The only thing anchoring me to reality was the rapid hammering of my heart. Then, a breath. Not mine. Not Holmes. Not Acton's. Something else. You were never here. The whisper slathered through the air, curling around my ears like a hand dragging me into deep water. I reached for my revolver with shaking fingers. Holmes. The sharp movement to my left. A hand gripped my wrist. "Stay still, Watson." Holmes' voice murmured, low and controlled. My throat was dry. "Something else is in here." I felt Holmes shift beside me. "Yes," he whispered. Acton let out a strangled breath. "They found us." A flicker of movement in the dark. The shape shifting just beyond sight, barely tangible. A presence, unseen yet undeniable, coiling through the air like a serpent of smoke. Then, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate sound against the iron door. I forced myself to breathe. Holmes, the lantern. A sudden movement, Holmes striking a match. A brief flare of light, shadows recoiled. And for the briefest moment I saw them. Figures standing in the darkness. Not men, not entirely. Blurred, indistinct, shifting at the edges of reality. Their faces, if they had faces, were wrong, as though sculpted from the fog itself. My mind struggled to hold onto their forms, but the moment I tried to see them, the details melted away like ink in water. And their eyes. Black voids, not empty but hungry. Then, the match went out. Darkness swallowed us once more. Acton gasped. "They're already inside." Holmes moved swiftly, his hands working in the dark. "Watson, hold Acton." I obeyed without hesitation, seizing the trembling man's arm. His skin was ice-cold, clammy with fear. Holmes struck another match. This time, he didn't waste a second. He touched the flame to the wick of our lantern, and with a sputtering flicker, light returned. The chamber was empty. No figures, no shadows. Only the faint, lingering impression that something had been standing there just a moment before. Holmes exhaled through his nose. "It's worse than I suspected." Acton was shaking violently. "You don't understand," he rasped. "They're not just here to watch. They're here to correct." Holmes turned to him, his sharp gaze unreadable. To correct what exactly? Acton clenched his jaw, squeezing his eyes shut. "Us." My stomach twisted. "You mean?" Acton lifted his gaze to meet mine. His eyes, hollow and sunken, held the weight of a man who had seen something no human should ever witness. "They're not hunting us," he whispered. "They're rewriting us." A cold silence followed. Holmes' fingers tapped lightly against his coat. "Then we must act before we are unwritten entirely." Acton swallowed hard. "It's already started." Holmes glanced at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Acton hesitated, then lifted his hand. I sucked in a breath. His fingers were fading. Not vanishing. Not dissolving into dust. They were becoming unreal. Like a half-forgotten dream slipping through waking consciousness, the edges of his hand blurred, his skin flickering between existence and something less than nothing. Acton stared at his own hand, horror flickering across his face. "They're taking me piece by piece." Holmes moved instantly, his mind working at impossible speed. "Then we have no time left. Acton, listen carefully. Where is the fracture?" Acton's mouth opened, but his words caught in his throat. He pressed his fingers to his temple, gasping in pain. Holmes grabbed his shoulders. "Henry, where is it?" Acton squeezed his eyes shut, his breath ragged. "I wrote it down. I knew I'd forget, so I—" His eyes snapped open. "The book." Holmes' grip tightened. "What book?" Acton's breath quickened. "The one place they can't erase. The thing that doesn't belong. The record that remembers." I inhaled sharply. "The ledger." Holmes nodded, comprehension dawning in his sharp gaze. "The book you found in the records office. The one with your name still written inside. Acton's eyes burned with desperate urgency. It's still there, he whispered. It has to be. Holmes released him, turning sharply to me. Watson, we must retrieve that ledger immediately. I hesitated. And then what? Holmes' expression was unreadable. Then we make sure we are not erased before we find the truth. Acton let out a sharp, shuddering breath. You won't make it in time, he rasped. Holmes turned back to him. Then tell us now, where is the fracture? Acton's mouth opened. Then his entire body convulsed. I lunged forward, catching him before he collapsed. His entire form shuddered violently, as though something inside him was being torn away. Holmes crouched beside us. Fight it, he commanded, his voice low and firm. You are still here, Acton. You exist. Acton's lips moved. A single word escaped in a breathless whisper. Charing Cross. Then his body fractured. Not like a man dying, not even like a man fading, but like something breaking apart from reality itself. I gasped as Acton's form split, his very existence unraveling in jagged, impossible fragments, one moment whole, the next a flickering absence where he had been. Holmes' grip tightened around his arm. Acton. Acton's gaze met his, and in that final moment, a small, knowing smile touched his lips. Then he was gone. Not collapsed, not disintegrated, simply gone. The air where he had been was wrong, as though the universe itself had sealed over his absence like a wound that had never been there at all. Silence. Holmes remained still for several long seconds. Then slowly he rose to his feet. His expression was unreadable. Watson. I swallowed hard. Yes. Holmes turned to me, his voice calm. We are going to Charing Cross. Chapter 16. Holmes and I ascended from the tunnels beneath London in silence, the weight of Henry Acton's erasure pressing upon us like a thick fog. The city above was unchanged, oblivious to the impossible reality unraveling beneath its streets. But I felt it. Something had shifted. Acton was gone, not merely dead, erased. A man who had spoken, breathed, existed just moments ago was now nothing more than a fading echo in my mind. Holmes hailed a cab with his usual efficiency, as though we had just left an ordinary crime scene, but there was a stiffness to his movements, a tension I had rarely seen. As the cab rattled toward Charing Cross, I exhaled, willing my pulse to steady. Holmes, do we even know what we are looking for? Holmes kept his gaze fixed on the streets rushing past. A fracture. And what is a fracture? Holmes' hands pressed together. An inconsistency. A contradiction in the structure of reality. If Acton was correct, then there is something in Charing Cross that should not be. I frowned. A building? A tunnel. Holmes' lips barely moved. Perhaps, or perhaps something far worse. The way he said it made my stomach turn. We arrived at Charing Cross just as the gas lamps flickered in the gathering dusk. The streets were crowded, carriages rolling by, pedestrians moving with the hurried purpose of Londoners who had no idea their reality might be compromised. Holmes stepped onto the pavement, his gaze scanning the area like a machine cataloging every detail. I followed close behind. "Do you see it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. He turned in a slow, deliberate circle, his sharp eyes darting over every sign, every street lamp, every building facade. Then he stopped. I followed his gaze. At first, I saw nothing. Then I felt it. An alleyway. It was nestled between two buildings, nondescript, unremarkable. But the moment I laid eyes on it, my mind resisted. My thoughts slid over it, as though my brain could not hold on to the fact that it was there. I blinked. The alley seemed to shift, the bricks at its edges warping softly, like a mirage bending under heat. I forced myself to speak. Holmes, that wasn't there a moment ago. Holmes' expression darkened. It was always there, Watson. He strode forward, purposeful, unwavering. I followed, my steps slower. As we entered the alley, the sounds of London muffled. The lively hum of the city dimmed, as though we had stepped into a world just beside reality. The walls of the alley seemed old, not just in the way London was old, but in a way that suggested they had been forgotten. Then, a door. A simple wooden door set into the bricks, without a handle, without a keyhole. Just a blank surface, featureless. But there was something about it. Something wrong. Holmes reached out, brushing his fingers against the wood. His jaw tightened. This is it. I swallowed. How do you know? Holmes exhaled, his breath slow, controlled. Because my mind is telling me to look away. I understood what he meant. The moment I focused on the door, my own thoughts resisted, as if something deep inside me was screaming that it was not meant to be perceived. Holmes stepped back. This door does not lead to another room, Watson. A chill crawled up my spine. Then where does it lead? Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming in the dim light, to something that was removed, a place that no longer exists. I hesitated, and we're opening it. Holmes gave a thin smile. Of course. Then he raised his hand and knocked. The sound did not echo. It did not bounce from the alley walls. It simply disappeared. And then the door opened on its own. A gust of cold air swept out. I stepped back instinctively. Holmes. But he was already stepping through. I had no choice but to follow. The space inside was impossible. I had expected another alley, a hidden room, some abandoned passageway beneath London. But instead, it was a train station. Not one I recognized. Not one that should have existed. The architecture was Victorian yet wrong, the angles sharper than they should have been, the arches stretching too high. The gas lamps lining the platform flickered in uneven patterns, casting long, unnatural shadows. A single set of tracks disappeared into the darkness of an unseen tunnel. But the most unsettling thing was the lack of people. Not a single soul stood upon the platform, not a porter, not a passenger. Yet the air was filled with an eerie humming, like the remnants of voices long since silenced. Holmes exhaled, stepping forward. Extraordinary. I forced myself to move. Holmes, what is this place? He knelt, brushing his fingers across the dust-covered tiles. This is what remains of a station that was never meant to be found. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. We are standing inside a memory that should have been erased. A shiver ran through me. Then why is it still here? Holmes' gaze flickered. Because something is holding onto it. A chill pressed against the back of my neck. What do you mean? Holmes straightened, dusting off his coat. The past is a fragile thing, Watson. If one were to remove a piece of it, one must do so completely. But if even a fragment is left behind... His gaze turned toward the tracks. Then sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. A low, distant rumble filled the air. I turned sharply. Holmes. Then I saw it. The train, coming down the tunnel. But it was wrong. Not rusted, not old, but warped. As though reality itself was struggling to contain it. Its metal frame flickered at the edges, shifting between solid and something less than real. It should not have been there. It should not have existed. Holmes exhaled. I backed away. Holmes, we need to leave. Now. Holmes' fingers twitched. The train screeched against the rails, slowing as it approached. And then the doors opened. The station remained silent. The flickering gas lamps cast pools of dim light across the empty platform. No conductor, no passengers. And yet, The door stood open. Holmes took a single step forward. Holmes, I grabbed his arm. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Watson, we did not come this far to turn back now. I shook my head. We don't know where it leads. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely. Then, before I could stop him, he stepped onto the train. A second of hesitation. A single moment where I could have run. Then, with a curse under my breath, I stepped after him. The doors slammed shut, and the train began to move. Chapter 17. The moment the doors slammed shut, the air inside the carriage thickened. The lantern Holmes held cast flickering light across the polished brass fixtures and velvet seats, too clean, too untouched for a train that had no passengers. The hum of the city above was gone. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks. I exhaled sharply, my breath visible in the unnatural chill. Holmes, where is this train taking us? Holmes turned slowly, his sharp gaze sweeping over the empty compartment. That, Watson, is what we must determine. I glanced toward the door leading to the next carriage. The brass handle gleamed, unmarked by fingerprints, untouched by time. Had anyone ever used this train? Holmes moved forward, his fingers brushing the velvet seats. Do you notice anything, Watson? I swallowed. Besides the fact that we are aboard a ghost train. Holmes gave a small, approving smile. Besides that. I steadied myself, forcing my senses to sharpen. The air was wrong, not musty like an abandoned station, nor stale like a sealed room. It was preserved, like the space had been held in time, untouched by the years. And then I saw it, or rather, didn't see it. There's no dust, I murmured. Holmes nodded. Precisely. No dust, no wear, as though this train is caught in a moment that never ended. A cold sensation crawled up my spine. Holmes, I said carefully, if this train was erased from history, then why does it still exist? Holmes exhaled through his nose. Because something still remembers it. A heavy silence followed. Then, tap, tap. The sound came from the carriage door ahead of us. I stiffened. Holmes. Holmes raised a hand, motioning for silence. He stepped forward, his fingers closing around the brass handle. He turned it. The door creaked open. The next carriage was identical to the one we stood in. The same velvet seats, the same untouched brass fixtures, a perfect replica. Except a single newspaper lay on the seat. Holmes approached it cautiously, lifting the brittle pages with care. He studied the print for only a moment before his sharp eyes flicked up to meet mine. Watson, he murmured, look at the date. I stepped forward. My stomach dropped. The date was tomorrow. I swallowed hard. Holmes, how is this possible? He did not answer immediately. His gaze flickered, calculating, absorbing every detail. Then slowly he folded the paper and placed it back upon the seat. We are not merely on a forgotten train, he murmured. We are on a train that does not abide by time as we know it. A slow, dreadful realization settled over me. Then when is it taking us? Holmes turned toward the far door. There is only one way to find out. He stepped forward. I hesitated. The air inside the carriage seemed to pulse, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Then the lantern flickered, and for the briefest moment I saw something between the carriages. A figure. Not a passenger, not a conductor. Something else. Its form was blurred, shifting, as though reality itself refused to hold it in place. The moment the light steadied, it was gone. Holmes turned. Watson. I clenched my jaw. We're not alone. Holmes exhaled softly. No, he agreed. We are not. He reached for the next door, and together we stepped forward. Chapter 18. Holmes pulled the brass handle of the next carriage door. The hinges let out a slow, mournful creak as it swung open. What lay beyond was not another passenger compartment. It was darkness. Not the darkness of an unlit room or an empty tunnel, but a deep, endless void, stretching beyond reason. The edges of the doorway flickered, shifting, as though our reality was struggling to contain something it was never meant to hold. Holmes did not hesitate. He stepped forward. "Holmes!" I grabbed his arm, panic tightening my chest. "You cannot mean to step into that." He turned his gaze to me, his expression calm, yet grave. "Watson, do you trust me?" "With my life," I said without hesitation. "Then let us go forward," he said, "for there is no path back." I exhaled, bracing myself, and together we stepped into the abyss. The moment we crossed the threshold, the train vanished. Not in a slow fade, not in a blur of motion, but in an instant, as though it had never existed at all. Holmes and I stood upon a vast open platform, yet I could see no walls, no ceiling, no supporting beams. The air around us was thick, humming with an unnatural stillness. And then I saw them. Figures stood in the distance, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, not moving, not breathing. Their forms flickered, their edges shifting in and out of reality, as if they were trapped between existence and nothingness. Holmes exhaled. The erased. A shudder ran through me. The people who were taken. Holmes nodded. Not killed, not dead, simply removed. I swallowed hard, my eyes scanning the endless rows of silent figures. Is Acton here? Holmes was already moving. We walked past them, the air around us pulsing with something I could not name. The figures did not turn, did not react to our presence, yet I felt their awareness, as though they were watching without eyes, listening without ears. And then Holmes stopped. Before us, one figure stood clearer than the others. Henry Acton. His body flickered, his outline unstable, but his eyes still burned with awareness. Holmes stepped forward. "Acton, can you hear me?" For a long moment there was silence. Then, yes, the voice was weak, but his own. Holmes' eyes gleamed with determination. "Tell me, what is this place?" Acton's gaze was hollow, tired. "The place where time forgets." I felt a chill settle in my bones. Holmes' jaw tightened. "Then it is still possible to leave." Acton shook his head. "Not without the key." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "A key? What key?" Acton's breath came shallow. "The fracture." He faltered. His form shuddered, and I could see pieces of him slipping, as though reality itself was trying to erase him once more. Holmes gripped his shoulder. "Hold on. Where is the fracture?" Acton lifted a trembling hand. He pointed behind us. I turned and felt my breath catch. In the distance, past the rows of flickering figures, past the endless void, a single door stood alone. Not made of iron, not rusted or worn, but wooden, plain, unmarked, as though it had always been there. "The door," Holmes murmured. "Of course." Acton's form wavered, his voice barely audible. "It leads back, but only if you take the memory with you." Holmes' fingers tightened. "And what of you?" Acton gave a slow, tired smile. "I am already forgotten." Holmes shook his head. "Not yet." And then Holmes did something that defied all logic. He reached into his own coat pocket and pulled out Acton's name. I do not know how. I do not know why. But there it was, written in Holmes' precise script on the folded scrap of parchment, the name that was never meant to be remembered. Holmes stepped forward, pressing the paper into Acton's fading hands. "Take it," Holmes murmured. "Hold on to it. Acton's fingers curled around the paper. The air shuddered. The figures around us stirred, as though sensing a shift. Acton's form grew clearer, his edges sharpened, as though his existence was returning. Then, the ground trembled. The forgotten world began to collapse. Holmes grabbed my arm. "Watson, the door, run." We turned and sprinted. The air behind us ripped apart, the void collapsing, the erased world imploding. Figures vanished. The silence roared. And then, Holmes threw open the door. We fell through. I gasped, lungs burning. I was on the ground, the cold pavement of Charing Cross beneath me. The night air hit my skin, the sound of carriages and gas lamps flickering around us. The city was unchanged. Holmes stood beside me, dusting off his coat. Slowly, I turned. And there, standing beside us, was Henry Acton. He was real, whole, his form solid in the gaslight. He existed. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We did it. Holmes merely gave a satisfied nod. "Yes, Watson, we did." Acton's voice was hoarse. "They'll try again." Holmes exhaled. "Let them try. We will always remember." Acton gave him a long look. Then for the first time he laughed. A quiet, tired sound. Holmes smiled faintly. "Come, gentlemen. Let us get off the streets before the city decides to forget us once more." And with that we walked into the London night, leaving the door forever closed behind us. The end.